Hello YouTube, Bane 666 here. Well, I was working on a number of other videos, but I just saw a video from Steve Shives which I thought deserved an immediate response, so here it is.
One of the worst parts of this year's U.S. presidential election was how the candidacy of Donald Trump gave a platform and a megaphone to some of the most vile elements of American society. But one of the best parts of this year's election was how, by amplifying those harmful elements, it exposed them to mainstream scrutiny for the first time that I can remember. Didn't wind up making a difference in the result of the election, unfortunately, but you know the old saying, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, all hope in everything. Anyway, one of those harmful elements is rape culture.
Rape culture, Steve. Okay, can you give us maybe a feminist definition of what rape culture is, just so we know what we're talking about, Steve? Thanks, mate.
Rape culture is not a new concept, despite some anti-feminists insisting otherwise. Rape culture is an environment in which rape is prevalent and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture.
Hold on a second. Let's listen to that again.
Rape culture is an environment in which rape is prevalent and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture.
Now, did you notice one thing there? Steve said against women. So, using Steve's definition, that would mean that a recent case in England is not an example of rape culture. You see, what happened was a 37-year-old woman got a 14-year-old boy drunk and then proceeded to have sex with him. And when she went to court, even though she had admitted guilt, she was given a suspended sentence. Now, according to Steve, that is not rape culture because the victim was a male, which actually, when you think about it, that line of thinking where you're dismissing victims based on their sex, that actually sounds an awful lot like rape culture, Steve. If there was such a thing as rape culture, then I think dismissing victims based purely on their gender would be an example of rape culture. But of course you wouldn't agree because only female victims count. Right, Steve? Even when the victim is a 14-year-old boy, apparently they don't fucking count because they're the wrong gender. Right, Steve? And the ironic thing is that people like Steve have the nerve to accuse people like me of only bringing up male victims to derail feminist conversations. Sorry, Steve. The reason why we bring up male victims is because assholes like you aren't fucking talking about them. When you present a definition like you just did, which only includes females and excludes male victims, including 14-year-old boys who got drunk thanks to a 37-year-old woman who apparently isn't responsible because she was drunk. When people like you don't talk about those things, it means people like me have no choice but to. Now, I've heard dozens and dozens of feminists talk endlessly about the Brock Turner case. I haven't heard one single feminist talk about this 14-year-old boy and the 37-year-old woman getting away with it, getting a suspended sentence because she was drunk. Now, if it was a 37-year-old male who had slept with a 14-year-old drunk girl and went to court and pleaded guilty, but then said, oh, well, I wasn't really in control because I was drunk, do you think anyone would be accepting that as an excuse? I know the feminists wouldn't. They would be saying it's an example of rape culture. They'd be saying, look at the fucking patriarchy. But when it's a 14-year-old boy, fuck him. Right, Steve? Because he's the wrong fucking gender. But remember, folks, remember, feminism is about equality of the genders. Right, Steve?
That definition comes from the Marshall University Women's Center's webpage, which is a great starting point for learning about this subject. If you're looking for something a bit more in-depth, I would recommend this book. Transforming a Rape Culture, edited by Emily Buchwald, Pamela Fletcher, and Martha Roth, which was published in 1993, by the way. The Marshall University Women's Center's webpage has a list of attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate rape culture, many of which Donald Trump has been demonstrating through his words and deeds for decades.
So the really interesting thing about this list is it genders sexual assault and rape. Right, rape is something done to women by men, and everything in this list suggests that, except for one comment. The third last one says, assuming that men don't get raped or that only weak men get raped. That is the only mention of male victims. Everything else assumes that the victim is a female and the perpetrator is a male. So I would argue that gendering sexual assault and rape is, in fact, a rape culture. Now, I'm not suggesting we live in a rape culture. I am suggesting that attitude is a rape culture, and I'll define that a bit more later on.
But for our purposes, let's focus on one particular example, the infamous Billy Bush tape, where Trump is heard bragging about how easy it is to assault women when you're a star.
Now, Steve just said here, bragging about how easy it is to assault women when you're a star. Keep that in mind for what he says in a moment.
The tape begins with Trump bragging about unsuccessfully trying to sleep with a married woman. Then he goes on to boast that when you're a star, you can just start kissing women and they let you do it. You can do anything, even, quote, grab them by the pussy.
Did you hear that? They let you do it. Do you not understand what consent is, Steve? When someone lets you do something, that is not sexual assault. If a woman lets Trump kiss her on the cheek or grab her on the pussy, that is not sexual assault. I think we need to send Steve to a consent class, because he doesn't seem to understand what the word let means, or consent, or sexual assault.
Following the release of the tape, Trump attempted to excuse his behavior by dismissing it as, quote, locker room talk. Someone dismissive of the concept of rape culture might point out that Donald Trump insists that he has never actually done any of the things that he brags about doing on the Billy Bush tape. One might also argue that these are the terrible attitudes of just one person, and they don't prove that rape culture is a valid concept when applied to the United States as a whole. Unfortunately, these arguments are refuted by the facts. The United States is a rape culture.
Now, instead of actually pointing out why this is wrong, I'm actually going to let another feminist point out to Steve why this is wrong. It's actually a feminist that Steve knows, by the way. But anyway, take it away, Garret.
So yeah,
First, my question is this consistent? If we're talking about America, then surely there are pockets in America which what you're saying is obviously true. You know, let's say the more religious areas, but would it be the same right across the board? Do you
no,
think?
and that is
anything consistent in America. To be
no,
honest.
but that's my point. We often hear
like
that we live in a rape culture, and everywhere is a rape culture, but.
But that, like, I assume you saw my Armored Skeptic video where I debunked that, right? That's not what feminists are saying when they talk about rape culture. It's like gun culture. Bringing up gun culture in America isn't saying everybody owns a gun. It's just saying there's too many guns, you know. And that's the same thing with rape culture. It's not saying that everybody believes in rape myths. Like, everybody would, if you did a survey saying, can women get pregnant from being raped, you wouldn't get 100% of people saying no.
I made a video about rape culture. And I said that I don't think we live in a rape culture because I think that's somewhat arbitrary.
Well, that phrasing though is it's
phrasing, yeah.
It's not.
But
it's not.
You,
how you
you
talk
agree
about
it's another abused term then?
Well, I mean, people talk about it in the wrong way in terms of it is what it is it's a sociological shorthand for a model, right? So it's the way that sociologists and other people like cultural anthropologists can talk to each other about a thing they both study in a quick and easy way without going into all the, you know, so they say this rape culture thing, or they do it all across the board in the social sciences. That's just how it is. But people from the outside looking in see that as reductionist. And it is reductionist, but it's just the way that people in an in-group situation where they all have the same level of knowledge, talk to each other. If you don't have that level of knowledge, then yeah, it can be totally misleading.
I just think it's funny because... Oh, sorry, cutting you off now.
No, go on.
Well, I was just... Everybody pretty much agrees that rape culture is a thing. They just disagree about where and to what extent, basically.
Yeah, and like...
Yeah, I would somewhat agree with that.
And saying
like, I think everyone agrees that there's a rape culture in prison, for example.
And yeah, and that's
Sure.
the other thing, is that's why it's reductionist. Because if you were actually going to be talking about it in terms of being 100% accurate, what you would say is rape cultures, right? Because there's multiple different variations of things where you can notice trends that aren't connected to each other, right? And just saying a rape culture makes it sound like it's universally pervasive and universally applicable and doesn't manifest in these totally different ways. So, yeah, saying we live in a rape culture isn't accurate. But saying that rape cultures exist in the society we live in, that's accurate.
And saying something is a rape culture does not contradict with saying that all of society is a rape culture. Like, you can have, like you just said, that cultures. Like
yeah, well, exactly.
Prison,
the term,
and not even every prison. Like some prisons wouldn't have a rape culture. Like, it really, you know.
The misleading word is. It's has. It's not is a rape culture, because that makes it sound like it defines the whole society.
Yeah, there's more things in society than just people raping each other. So by definition, it doesn't make sense.
Like bring it back to gun culture. There's people in America who are totally manically opposed to guns, so they don't live in a gun culture in the same way that the gun nuts do, right? They do in one sense, in a passive sense, but not in an active sense. They reject it, and obviously it's the same with rape. There's anti-rape activists, so it's obviously not 100% universally pervasive in terms of.
The only way people in America express themselves is through guns. They have no other way of expressing themselves. Like when you're making a speech, you're just like.
And so, yeah, I totally admit that the way some people talk about things from the social sciences with regard to feminism and stuff is wrong.
Yeah.
But that's not the academics' fault, you know. That's people looking from the outside in and having misconceptions. Now, if they don't...
Those people from the outside looking in, though, are usually feminists, aren't they? They're in the media. They're
exactly.
On
they're
the
a
internet,
big part of it. Yeah, they're a big.
So how do we fix that? I mean, if a word is overused too much, if it's misused too much, it becomes meaningless, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, apart from to the people who actually study it, they will keep using it. But to society at large, yeah, it loses some of its meaning. Absolutely. And the way you fix it is the same way you fix all of this kind of problem: is misinformation on the internet. You know, trying to encourage people to check their sources when they post shit on social media, stuff like that. That needs to go way up, because at the moment there's just almost on a daily basis I see people putting out stuff that just is flagrantly false on social media, you know. And they get pissy when you correct it too. Sorry.
Christy Winters just sent me a message. If you see this during your live stream, the graphic has been on screen for about 10 minutes now.
Oh, right. Yes, true. Sorry. I always do that.
Stop criticizing us, Christy.
So I would have to agree with Garret. I don't think society is a rape culture. However, I will admit that society does contain certain rape cultures, and I gave an example in that talk. What happens in prison is clearly a rape culture. And I also gave another example earlier in this video. Whenever an adult woman sleeps with an underage boy, even in cases where she gets the boy drunk, more often than not she will be given a slap on the wrist or no sentence, and in some cases she's believed when she cries victim. It wasn't my fault, he seduced me type bullshit. And the fact that certain aspects of society excuse that away, I would say, is a type of rape culture. And the fact that society in general doesn't give a shit about it is also a type of rape culture. Now, the two examples I've given have one thing in common. The majority of the victims of rape in prison are male. But according to Steve Shives' definition, that isn't a rape culture, because rape culture only affects women. And of course, adult women sleeping with underage boys and then getting no penalty or a slap on the wrist when they're caught, once again, that's not a rape culture, because Steve's definition only includes women. However, sexually explicit jokes apparently is rape culture. So, men being raped in prison, or boys being raped by adult women, and society not giving a shit about that, according to Steve's own source, that isn't rape culture. But telling sexually explicit jokes is. Do you see a problem with this definition? And this is the ironic thing here, right? The ironic thing is Steve is lecturing all of us about what rape culture is, but in fact, he is promoting a rape culture because he can only see female victims. He is blind to the male victims. He had a choice here. He gave us his definition, which he found on the internet and said it was a good definition. He could have found another definition which was gender neutral. He chose not to. He defined the term here, and ironically, in doing so, gave us the perfect example of a rape culture.
And the reaction to the Billy Bush tape by a significant portion of the American people proves it. Let's start with Trump's explanation that what we hear on the Billy Bush tape is simply, quote, locker room talk. I'm going to give Trump's words on that tape the most charitable reading possible and imagine that Trump has never actually done the sorts of things that he describes himself doing on that tape. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that what we hear Donald Trump saying on that tape is nothing more than, quote, locker room talk. Even with that assumption in place, we still have Donald Trump bragging to his fellow men about how, thanks to his celebrity, he can force himself on women and molest them at will and get away with it.
Once again, Steve, he used the word let. Do you not understand what the word let means, Steve? And the ironic thing is, once again, Steve's definition excludes a 14-year-old boy who not only was underage and therefore could not give consent, but was also too drunk to give consent. And when society doesn't give a shit about him, apparently that's not rape culture because he's a boy, according to Steve. But, we should all lose our shit because Trump said some women let him kiss them on the cheek or grab them on the pussy. That's clearly the more important issue, isn't it, Steve? After all, that fits in with your fucking narrative of the male abuser and the female victim, doesn't it? And of course, that fucking narrative is a rape culture. You, Steve, are part of a rape culture. I hope you're fucking proud of yourself, mate.
If Donald Trump doesn't actually do those sorts of things to women, then he's making it up. He's bragging about imaginary sexual assaults to his fellow men because he assumes, correctly, as it turns out, judging by the reactions of the other men on that tape, that they will respond with approval and admiration. What was that definition of rape culture again?
Now, once again, it's very interesting that Steve chose a definition which excludes male victims. So what he's saying here is Trump talking about women letting him kiss them on the cheek or grab them on the pussy is an example of rape culture and how society promotes rape against women and only women. But using Steve's definition, which excludes men, something like this would not be rape culture. So a Scottish bar recently banned their barmen from wearing kilts because drunk women kept on groping them on the penis. People at their workplace doing their work and they're being sexually assaulted by women who felt that they were entitled to just, reach under their kilt and grab them on the penis. Apparently, that isn't rape culture, according to Steve, because the victims are male. Apparently, according to Steve, that doesn't count as rape culture. But Trump, talking about women letting him kiss them on the cheek or grab them on the pussy, apparently that is rape culture. You are a massive fucking hypocrite, Steve. You should be fucking ashamed of yourself.
Don't go far. I'm going to need you again in a second. Now let's consider how people responded to Trump's locker room talk excuse. True, many of us didn't buy it, but many of us did. In fact, many of us echoed it ourselves, saying that we and other men that we know talk about women that way all the time. So not only was Trump correct when he assumed that his bragging about being able to sexually assault women would be met by the approval and the admiration of the other men on that Access Hollywood bus, many of us stepped forward and said that we do the exact same thing all the time. So if we live in a society where people regularly brag about sexually assaulting others in order to impress people,
You really don't understand the word let, do you, Steve? I'm going to have to buy you a dictionary for Christmas. I can see that.
and we do it so regularly and are so comfortable with it that we seem to not understand why other people are upset by it, how might you describe such a society?
And how exactly would you define an ideology, Steve, that excludes male victims of sexual assault and rape?
And to anyone who would still argue that rape culture is not a valid way of looking at American society, let me reiterate that those who accepted and repeated Donald Trump's locker room talk excuse have already admitted that we live in such a culture where people feel at liberty to brag about committing sexual assault in order to impress their buddies. Whether or not they are actually committing these crimes is beside the point. The crime of sexual assault is taken so lightly that it's considered praiseworthy to claim that you do it. And if you have already admitted that we live in such a society, you have admitted that we live in... But wait, someone might object. According to that definition, a rape culture is not merely an environment where rape is excused and normalized, but where rape is prevalent. And if we are assuming for the sake of argument that Trump and others who engage in locker room talk aren't actually committing the sexual assaults they brag about committing, how can we say that rape is prevalent in the United States? Well, we can say that rape is prevalent in the United States because we have crime statistics testifying to that fact. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in the year 2014, the most recent year for which I could find data, there were 284,350 rapes and sexual assaults reported in the U.S.
Now, this is very, very interesting. Steve tells us that outside of prison, 284,350 rapes and sexual assaults were reported for 2014. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find the equivalent number of prison assaults for 2014, but I did find some for 2008. And that number is 216,000. So the number is less than the 284,350, but obviously the prison population is a much smaller number of people. But there's something else you should take into consideration too. Now, the number Steve gives us is the number of rapes and sexual assaults reported. The number I gave you from prison was the number of victims. Now, I think it's safe to assume that most of the victims of rape and sexual assault in prison would have been raped more than once. In fact, some of them are probably raped on a weekly basis. So the 216,000 number is just really the tip of the iceberg if we were to look at the number of overall assaults. And I think it's safe to say that the number of assaults in prison, therefore, would be far higher than 284,350. So Steve would have us believe that America as a whole is a rape culture. But the fact that we don't give a shit about male prisoners being raped in prison isn't a rape culture because, by Steve's own definition, it's something that can only happen to women. Therefore, male prisoners just don't count. I think we might have found the real rape culture here, Steve, and I think it's people like you.
To put that number in perspective, that same year there were 33,599 total gun-related deaths, according to the Centers for Disease Control. There were also 47,055 drug overdose deaths that year, again, according to the CDC. The number of gun deaths in the U.S. is considered by many of us to be a national tragedy, and the federal government has been conducting a so-called war on drugs since the Nixon administration. And yet in 2014, there were 8.5 times as many rapes and sexual assaults reported as there were gun deaths, and 6 times as many rapes and sexual assaults reported as there were drug overdose deaths.
Okay, I have to point out a little fault in Steve's logic here. Now, let me say first off, before going on, that obviously any form of rape or sexual assault is wrong. But these figures do include the term sexual assault, and sexual assault is far more than rape, which is one of the worst examples of sexual assault. So let's have a look at the list of things which are sexual assault from womenshealth.gov. So it says here, sexual assault can include any type of sexual contact with someone who cannot consent, such as someone who is underage, has an intellectual disability, or is passed out. Rape. Attempted rape. Sexual coercion. Sexual contact with a child. Incest, fondling or unwanted touching above or under clothing. It goes on to say, sexual assault can also be verbal or visual. It is anything that forces a person to join in unwanted sexual contact or attention. Examples can include voyeurism, exhibitionism, sexual harassment or threats, and forcing someone to pose for sexual pictures. Now, it should be apparent that some of these things are far, far worse than others. Once again, I'm not excusing any of them. I'm not saying any of them are acceptable. But I think everyone would agree that they would prefer someone flashing their penis or tits or whatever at them on a bus rather than being raped or being sexually molested as a child. Those two things are a world apart. And that's the problem with Steve's argument here, is that his number includes all these things. Now, once again, if I had the choice of someone flashing their penis or tits at me on a bus or being shot by someone with a handgun, have a guess which one I would choose. So what Steve has done is he is taking the very worst case example with handgun deaths, right? Instances which have resulted in someone dying, and compared them to a number which is not only bad instances, but instances which aren't anywhere near as bad. So for a proper comparison, you wouldn't just take handgun deaths, you'd take threats made by people with handguns, you'd take people shot and injured by handguns, you'd take people who have been shot at and the bullets have missed, and a whole range of other things as well, which would make the number a lot higher than what Steve has represented here. But just as being fondled against your will is not as bad as rape, and being shot and surviving isn't as bad as being shot and killed. Do you see my point? Steve has been a little bit disingenuous with his statistics here.
Just in case that isn't pervasive enough for you, let me present for your consideration one final bit of information, also from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. On average, an estimated 211,200 rapes and sexual assaults went unreported to police each year between 2006 and 2010. Although serious violent crime was generally less likely to go unreported to the police than simple assault, a higher percentage of rape or sexual assault, 65%, than simple assault, 56%, victimizations went unreported over the 5-year period. So take the 284,350 rapes and sexual assaults reported in 2014 and assume there were at least another 200,000 that occurred but weren't reported. That's nearly 500,000 rapes and sexual assaults in the United States in a year. An environment where rape is prevalent and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture.
And male victims are excluded or forgotten because of their gender. You forgot that part, Steve. You need to add that part to your definition.
That's us. And Donald Trump is our mascot. And our next president.
I know no other words to express my regret other than I'm sorry.
An emotional Kara Dickey, a mother of 3, asked the judge to give her a chance to prove she can be the good woman she once was.
But my actions during that time do not define my character. That is not who I am.
The 30-year-old had already confessed to sleeping with one of her students twice. Police say she gave the 14-year-old rum, Tylenol, and NyQuil as part of a suicide pact. The victim's father, with tears rolling down his face and barely able to speak, told the judge the former teacher has caused his family devastating pain.
You know, Kara, you're a very selfish person, okay? You did our child, and you understand that.
The prosecutor read a statement from his son, who is now 15. He says Dickey's actions have scarred him for life.
This lady is sick and selfish, and she really had me not even caring about anyone but her.
Your despicable actions must be punished appropriately.
Kara Dickey will now spend 4 years in prison, and she can never teach in New York State again.
Teacher who served prison time for having sex with a student is in trouble once again. Kara Dickey is on the run, and her parole officers think she has a new victim. A woman who law enforcement believes is Kara Dickey called our newsroom this morning. News 4's Brittany Smallwood walks us through the bizarre twists and turns in this case. Brittany?
And a woman claiming to be Kara Dickey says she's on the run and won't return till the record is set straight. I spoke with her this morning, and here's what she had to say. Convicted sex offender Kara Dickey is still on the run. A New York State parole officer says Dickey called an official last night and said she'd turn herself in, but only under certain circumstances. If her warrant was canceled, if officials stopped saying she was with an underage male, and if 2 specific officers come to get her. But authorities said no, she has no room to negotiate. Not long ago, parole received information that Dickey is involved with another underage boy. But a woman claiming to be Dickey called our studios this morning and said that isn't true. A New York State parole officer who heard the recording says this is Dickey on the phone.
My violation has to come with being involved in fraternizing with another felon, a grown woman. The only thing that had anything to do with the child is that we spent Christmas, a nice Christmas, with her little brother.
Dickey said she knew that spending Christmas with her girlfriend and a 6-year-old boy violated her parole.
He was in a bad situation and we wanted to have a nice Christmas for him. That was the only thing.
Dickey is on parole for having sex with a minor. In 2009, the former South Buffalo charter school teacher confessed to having a sexual relationship and suicide pact with a 14-year-old student. Authorities say she removed her ankle bracelet and disappeared sometime Wednesday. I asked Dickey on the phone when she'll return. She said things have to turn around before she'll come back.
This needs to be fixed. This needs to be fixed. It needs to be addressed. Speak directly with parole if you need to, so that they can clarify that that information is incorrect. They know that it needs to be changed before I turn myself in.
And where are you now?
Thank you.
If Dickey is caught, authorities say she'll face charges for breaking parole. She's supposed to be on parole until 2020.